Welcome back for another episode of Leadership That Liberates. This week, I want to talk about something that has been on my mind the last few days, just because it seems to be coming up again and again. And so I've been reflecting on it a lot, and I thought it could be a really interesting topic for us to explore together. And that is around politics and polarization. And I feel just in and of themselves, these topics can be a little bit like we're just like, no. I would rather not go there. They're not that appealing. And that's part of why I want to talk about this. Because what I'm seeing and hearing in so many spaces is people saying some version of, I don't do politics. Politics isn't what I'm about. That's not part of my message. I don't get involved with that. I don't follow politics. Different versions or iterations of this same kind of sentiment of like, me and politics don't mix. And I once felt the same way. I once also was like, I'm not interested in that. I don't like that. That's not my thing. I think there are a lot of reasons for this. And that's really what I want to get into today and to talk about how those reasons, I think, add to and contribute to polarization, which politics in and of itself is polarizing. It is a very polarizing topic, and all of the things within it are polarizing, the different conversations kind of under that umbrella. And through our avoidance of the potential for polarization, I actually think we create more of the same. And so this is why I wanted to speak about this. And I will say that when it comes to politics, for myself, it can be an area which really does bring up a lot of my own kind of superiority, self-righteousness, where I think I'm right, other people are wrong, a lot of judgment, a lot of shame-centered kind of thinking about other people's worldviews. And it feels important to name that because I think it's pretty human. I think that's part of the challenge and part of why this can be so polarizing, because that's not unique to me. I think that comes up and out for most of us around these topics, which is part of why we're avoiding them. And so I really want to get into this today because I think it could be useful for us to explore why so many of us do feel uncomfortable with politics and why we separate ourselves from it, but then unintentionally add to and perpetuate the problems that we're actually trying to avoid by not talking about politics. There are different layers to this. First, I will say that I think part of what has shifted for me, or why I don't necessarily perceive politics in the way that I used to as something that I can just choose not to engage with, is because I think our humanity has been politicized. And for me, from my own perspective, to choose to turn away from political conversations or from political sort of topics, it's in many ways to turn away from our humanity because our humanity has been politicized. Politics, in so many ways, is an infringement upon and an attack on our humanity and our right to be free beings and our right to self-autonomy and to choices about our own lives. In that sense, how can I just choose not to engage with politics? Because in essence, by doing that, I'm also choosing not to engage with humanity, our shared humanity. Part of the reason that some people can make this choice is because of privilege. I very much think it was the case for me when I viewed politics in the way that I did in the past. I have a choice not to engage with that because it's not really affecting me, because my identities are privileged. And it's interesting. I said I've seen and heard this sentiment shared in a variety of ways in a number of different spaces over the last weeks. And in every case, it was a white woman who said that. We know that women are marginalized in many ways and are oppressed in many ways, and white women are still incredibly privileged. We can choose to opt out of political conversations because we're not as affected by political policy as so many other folks and identities. When your safety and security is directly at risk as the result of political policy, it's not really so easy to just make a choice to not engage with it. And I'm not saying that marginalized or oppressed people are all on the political bandwagon of like, let's be involved in politics or let's follow these conversations. Part of what I think we want to do is move away from absolutes. And an absolute would be to say that all these people care about this and all these people don't. Obviously, that's not the case. Just generally speaking, it's a lot more likely that a person with identities of privilege would make the choice to disengage from politics, whereas other people don't necessarily have the same choice. So that's one layer of it. Beyond that, I think part of why we're so avoidant when it comes to politics is because it does encompass so many controversial topics, and controversy creates conflict. Like I said before, around, how my sense of superiority or self-righteousness comes through in conversations like this, or can really be activated or brought to the surface. That's the case for many people. So when we engage in conversations around politics, often they're not conversations, they're arguments, because we disagree and we don't know how to bridge the divide between these differing perspectives. And so there's a discomfort that feels innately present in conversations around politics, and also this potential for conflict, the potential to argue about our disagreements. I think this is why, especially in a US context, both politics and religion are taboo topics, right? It's like we don't talk about those things. It's almost culturally known, right? That you just avoid conversations about politics and religion because they are both very polarizing topics. They're both areas in which we likely have very clear convictions, very clear beliefs, very clear opinions, and we can be very, again, self-righteous in those perspectives, dogmatic in those points of views. Our opinions and our convictions when it comes to those things are so personal because they are a reflection of our values. And so they don't just represent the things we care about or the things that we believe in, but they represent our core sense of self in so many ways. And so when we're defending, quote unquote, defending our point of view, we're also in a way defending ourselves. And when we're arguing against somebody else's perspective, we are in a way arguing against who they are as a person. Though I don't think that the two are innately inseparable, but I think that psychologically we tend to bind them together, which is part of the problem because we don't just see a person who has XY beliefs. We see a person as synonymous with their beliefs, that those beliefs fundamentally represent who they are on a moral, ethical level. This is interesting because I used to facilitate a cross-cultural exchange program between students from the US and students from Germany. And Germans, they're very good at compartmentalizing. You can have a really heated discussion or debate on a topic, and you can have two very different perspectives or points of view on that. And you can disagree with a person's opinion without making it mean something about who they are as a person. It's almost like you can separate that person's opinion from who they are. Whereas I think in the US, at least, we don't really do that very well. And so the German students always had this curiosity when they would come to the US for this exchange program of, why don't y'all talk about religion and politics? Because for them, it was hard to understand the type of conflict generated by those conversations. Because it wasn't like they weren't willing to engage in conflict. They were, but they weren't taking things personally and they weren't assigning value to another person based on their views. Whereas I think in the US, that's not really how people engage with conversations around these topics. It very much is. I think your opinion is bad, and so I think you're bad. I think you harm people with your perspective, and so you are harmful, and therefore you're bad. I grew up in the Bible Belt, small town South Carolina, where people are very conservative, very religious, very Republican, which is very counter to my worldview and my perspective, which is part of the reason why I can feel so heated around politics, because I'm very exposed to perspectives that do not align with my own. And because of that, I have so many firsthand experiences of people who think so differently than me, whose values seem to be very different from my own, whose perspectives are very counter to mine, and yet I think they're good people. In activism spaces where people are supposedly for liberation, a lot of people aren't thinking like that. They're very absolute in their thinking. You're racist, you're bad. You don't support trans rights, you're a bad human. It's this conflation. And I'm not saying that racism or discrimination or prejudice against different identities is not harmful, but the ways in which we demonize and dehumanize people for not having the same beliefs we do, it's literally why we're in the problems that we're in. It's very much engaging in the exact kind of behaviors that we're against. There are probably people who are like, fuck you, Lena. mm, yeah, I think that's part of the problem. A lot of us, we avoid conversations around politics because we feel attacked when people disagree with us. We're attacking somebody else if we disagree with them. We don't know how to navigate conflict in healthy, productive, fruitful ways. Because conflict in and of itself is not bad. It's actually so human, such a part of life, such a process of being in relationship. It's unavoidable, but we don't know how to be with it. We don't know how to do it. We don't know how to do conflict. So we avoid conflict. This is part of why we have so many issues in our interpersonal relationships, why we have so much miscommunication, misunderstanding, bitterness, resentment, because we find conflict so uncomfortable. We're so conflict avoidant. And it's through the avoidance of conflict that there's more conflict. And again, I think it comes to our inability to be with discomfort, our inability to be with uncertainty or ambiguity or nuance or complexity. I'm either right or I'm wrong, and you're either right or you're wrong. And of course, I'm the one who's right and you're the one who's wrong. And that's how we're relating to each other, especially when it comes to these polarizing topics. And so people are avoiding them because it's really about avoidance of discomfort and avoidance of conflict and avoidance of confrontation and the avoidance of having our values and sense of self attacked, and also the avoidance of the discomfort that arises when our superiority and self-righteousness arises. Because what happens then is that we are essentially embodying that which we so dislike in the other person. We don't know how to bridge the divide, to find the common ground, to try to understand one another. Our dislike of the way this other person is presenting self-righteously, it's also, I think, bringing up an unconscious repulsion, because when we're in that polarizing space, we're actually being and behaving just like the quote unquote other side that we dislike. We feel this like, ugh, about the other person and their perspectives, because the way in which they're holding on to and defending their point of view is a reflection of how we're doing the same. It's like we can't see that we think we're better than other people. It's just like, oh, they think they know better. Well, you too. That's why you're so mad about it, you know? I think it really brings out our ugly, and that's why we don't like it. And I'm not saying that we're being combative or we're fighting with people. It's not necessarily about how we're doing it that I think brings up our discomfort with our own selves. It's just the fact that we're mirroring each other in the conflict or argument or debate or disagreement. We mirror each other, and that's what makes it so uncomfortable. I'm over here and you're over there. It's my way versus your way, my perspective versus your perspective, my worldview versus your worldview, this or that. And then the person's beliefs become who they are. And we are not our beliefs, and beliefs can change, especially when people are exposed to new information or have an experience that counters something they've always believed. That's why it's so important to engage with people who have different opinions and perspectives. That's how we learn and grow and change and evolve. Maybe your own viewpoint would be challenged if you actually listened to why somebody thinks or feels the way they do about a topic you don't agree with. I'm telling you, I'm going to repeat it. This can be very hard for me. Like I said, I grew up surrounded by people who think so differently than me. And I can be back home in my hometown and I will hear people say certain things and I'm just like, ugh, like my blood is boiling. And when I'm in that space, I'm very prone to reactivity, to superiority and dogmatism. How am I not then contributing to this problem of division and polarization if I'm operating from that place of self-righteousness? And I think what people on the left would say is their views and their perspectives, they, as in religious Republican Trump supporters, because that would be the camp of people who is quote unquote opposing my view or my perspective, or the majority of people likely listening to this. That's the quote unquote other side. And the argument would be their worldviews and their perspectives harm people and take away people's rights and people's safety and people's agency and people's autonomy. But do you know why that other side believes the things they believe or think the things they think or want the things they want in terms of policy and politics? Honestly, it's because they believe the same about this other side, that what you want infringes upon their rights and their values and what they believe to be good and right and true in the world. We're not seeking to understand the foundation, the root. What's really under the surface for both sides is fear. It's losing something, the fear of loss. We don't make any attempt to understand what the other person is afraid of. And maybe if we did that, if we tried to see the humanity of the other side, maybe we wouldn't hate them so much. And that doesn't mean that we have to agree with them. We don't have to come to agreement to find common ground. We don't have to come to an agreement to bridge a divide. The point is that we seek to understand each other and to humanize one another. I am going to share a little acronym. It's called PLEASE, PLEASE, please. Here it is, written in my notebook from, I don't know, 6 or 8 years ago. I don't know. This is so old. But it is really an acronym with these kind of principles of how to engage in polarizing conversations. The different principles here, the different practices, are really helpful in understanding how we can actually bridge divides and come to some kind of understanding of one another. And so the P in please is pause and don't take it personally. Pause. The point here being setting ourselves up to respond rather than to react, because we can be so reactive when it comes to these differing worldviews and perspectives. We're so reactive. And again, it's because our sense of self is being threatened. But the other part of this is don't take it personally. The other person's views are not actually about you. Even if they infringe on your right to exist as you are, it's still not actually about you. It's about a deeper fear that that person has, and it's not personal. And what's so interesting when we do look at conflict, especially war and conflict, big scale conflict, people very much have the capacity to exceptionalize. So and so is not like the rest of them. because it's more of an idea, a concept, an ideology, and less about an actual human. When someone is presented with an actual human in front of them, a person will often engage with that human in a different way as they would with their idea of what people like them are like. Obviously, this is not universally true, but the majority of people have the capacity to see beyond a person's identity if they have the opportunity to engage with them, to have conversation with them, to learn about them. This is why when I facilitate cross-cultural, intercultural sort of conversations or experiences, I really want to create a lot of space and opportunity for people to share their lived experience. Because when we can see our shared humanity, we think about people differently. And the more that we can engage and interact with people who represent something we don't like or disagree with, the more that we can shift our perspective around that bigger generalization that we have, that more blanketed prejudice we hold on to. The more that you can engage with a Trump supporter, the more that you can break away from the idea that they're all evil, terrible people, because it's actually not true. I know that there are people listening to this who don't agree with that. That's part of the problem. And I'm not judging you because I am you. I'm just inviting us to consider how we create the very division that we supposedly are against. So pause and don't take it personally. It's not actually personal. It is very often rooted in a person's own fears, and their fears come from so many layers of their lived experience that have nothing to do with you. When engaging in a polarizing conversation or a polarizing topic, pause and don't take it personally. The L is listen and suspend judgment. Can you listen to another person without your judgment clouding everything they're saying? Because when we come into a conversation with the stance that the other side is wrong, we can't actually listen because our security is threatened. Our sense of safety is at risk, and the part of our brains that have the capacity to be with complexity and nuance shut down. And I know that this is easier said than done. And I'm not saying that you are obligated to put yourself in that position. I think this is part of where discernment comes in. Maybe there are some people that you're not going to be able to have a conversation with because it actually is threatening to you. I'm not speaking about, apply this in every case, in every context, in every situation for all people. I'm actually not. But I'm also challenging us to think about ways in which we're not even willing to engage with difference, even when it's not threatening to us or doesn't actually create a lack of safety. Sometimes it does. And I'm not saying that's not true, but sometimes we're just not willing to go there. So, can we listen and suspend judgment? Can we really listen to another person's perspective or point of view without demonizing, dehumanizing, because we don't agree with them? The E in please is empathize. Can you try to consider how the other person feels or thinks from their perspective? And this is part of why I think it's so important. The context, right? The soil a person was planted in. What has shaped them? Why do they actually think the thing that they think or have the worldview that they have? Where does it come from? What is it rooted in? Where did they learn XYZ? How are they protecting themselves through their perspective in the same way that you are? The A in please, analyze assumptions and ask questions. Analyze your own assumptions because we are all coming to polarizing topics with assumptions and biases. So analyze your own assumptions and ask questions. Get curious. Why do you think that? How does that feel for you? Can you tell me more about that? Can you be curious about another person's experience? And when you start to understand the context or the underlying fear, then maybe you have more ability to empathize with their perspective. And again, it doesn't mean that you have to agree with them, but how are we ever going to create any potential for liberation, unity, interconnectedness if we're not willing to engage with people we don't agree with? It just reinforces and perpetuates me versus you, us versus them. The S is for speak in their own words. Very often, we have a tendency to hear something that is colored by our own assumptions and biases. And so oftentimes we're projecting onto the other person. They're saying something, and we're like, no, but you're saying this. Well, are those actually the words that they said? Like if you're having a conflict with your partner, right? Like, you know how you do that when you're arguing with your partner? Like, but you said this. And they're like, I didn't say that. Well, that's what I heard. Why did you hear that? Because you're listening from the lens of your own bias. Speak in their own words, not they said this, but you heard this. What did they actually say? I was having an argument with one of my exes once, and I can't even remember now what we were talking about. But I would say a sentence, and then he would be like, but you're saying this. And I'm like, that's literally not what I said. I said these words. But he's interpreting what I'm saying through the lens of his own fear, his own insecurity, his own assumptions, his own bias. He's literally hearing something different. And I can't even tell you how long we went back and forth, me repeating the sentence and him being like, but that's this. I'm like, no, it's not. That's what you heard. That is not what I said. And literally, I do that with my current partner all the time. He's like, I didn't say that. I'm like, but you said that. But it's literally not what he said. We do this all the time. We hear what we want to hear, not what the other person is actually saying. It's hard. It's hard not to hear through the lens of our past, of our wounds, from the perspective of our inner child. And that's why we want to analyze our own assumptions, because we're not ever coming into an interaction from a neutral place. Never. And then the E is expectation management. Manage your expectations. Are you expecting to convince the other person that what you think is right? Are you expecting that they are going to be converted to your perspective or point of view? Are you expecting that you're going to agree with each other at the end of the debate, the argument, the conflict, the conversation? That's not realistic. The point of engaging with a different perspective is not to convert the other person to your side. It's not to convince them that you're right. So we can't have expectations that that's what the end result will be. The point is to understand the other point of view so that we can dissipate some of the tension and the charge around the disagreement or the conflict in perspective. Because it's that charge and that tension and that energetic current of anger. That's what fuels the kind of conflict that is destructive and oppressive. We live in a world that is incredibly polarizing, and we perpetuate and create more of the same in our unwillingness to engage with people we don't agree with the other side, with the quote unquote oppressor. I am actually surprised at how fundamentalist and dogmatic and extreme people in the movement for liberation are. I actually have found more rigidity and inflexibility in that space than I have among the multitude of Trump supporters that I know. And I don't really understand how we think that we can create a movement for liberation if we can be so extreme in our insistence. We are right, and the other person has to think what we think and has to change their worldview to align with ours to be a good person. It's so counter to liberation. It is a replication of oppression. And I know there are a lot of people who don't want to hear that, who aren't open to hearing that, who don't agree with that. But I would ask you, can you be really honest with yourself about how you might play a role in perpetuating divisiveness? Because the systems we live within also live within us. We have internalized oppression, exclusion, We have internalized so many of the things that we're against, and we create more of the same when we're not willing to be honest about that. How are we contributing to the problem we have committed our lives to resolving? Because we are. My invitation to you is to really consider how the people you disagree with might actually be a mirror for some of your own qualities and biases. There are literal wars fought over this. The proximate other, that someone is actually so like us, and the discomfort of seeing ourselves in the other. That's why we demonize and dehumanize. We create a distance between us and them because it would actually be too uncomfortable to be like, I'm actually a lot like that person over there. So your invitation is to consider, how are the people you vehemently disagree with actually a mirror for things you might not want to see within yourself? And I hope to see you next week for the next episode of Leadership That Liberates.